Good evening. This makes me look incredibly tall, which I like. I'm just going to start with a short reading from the introductory chapter of the book, and then we'll start to chat. Even before the cats, before the dogs, before the chickens, before the turkeys, before the ducks and the guinea fowl and the betta fish and the Black Angus cattle, I was always a little animalish. I don't just mean as a child, since all children love animals and come by being animalish quite naturally. I don't just mean as a young girl, that golden moment when I, like millions of young girls throughout human history, fell into an adolescent swoon over horses and, to a lesser degree, puppies. I mean that somehow or other, in whatever kind of life I happen to be leading, animals have always been my style. They have been part of my life even when I didn't have any animals, and when I did have them, they always seemed to elbow their way onto center stage. Has it been a simple matter of mathematics? That is, have there been more creatures in my orbit than in other people's? Or do I merely notice them more and draw them a little closer than someone else might? There has certainly been an element of serendipity. I seem to have a higher than average tendency to find animals in my path. In 1986, when I was relocating to Manhattan, I resigned myself to what I assume would be a life with very little animal adjacency, except for the occasional dog or two. The day I moved into my new apartment, I unpacked a few boxes and then decided to go outside for some air. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I collided with a man who was walking a pet rabbit on a silver leash. I spun to a stop, flabbergasted. The man didn't register my surprise. He was too busy trying to manage the rabbit, which was huge, coffee-colored, and ornery. Each time the man took a step, the rabbit braced against the leash, stretching it taut, and only then, with a cold look in its eye, would it give a flabby, half-hearted leap. "Please, Rover, please," the rabbit's owner called out in an aching, exasperated voice. "Now that's a good Rover. Come on, boy, hop." The art critic and philosopher John Berger once said that we like to look at animals because they remind us of the past, and particularly of the agrarian life we used to lead that included the regular presence of animals. I agree, but I also think we look at animals because they're funny and companionable and interesting. Some of my animals have jobs. My chickens lay eggs. My dog scares the FedEx man. The cats, by their arrogant disregard of duty, serve to remind me that I have to schedule Terminix to come and chase the mice out of the basement. All of these creatures serve a purpose, even if that purpose is to have no real purpose other than to give a warm, wonderful, unpredictable texture to my life every day. I wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you.
Well, I'm such a fan of Susan Orlean's work. It's such an honor to be here. And I was honestly hoping you were going to read about the hens. You know, one thing that I think when I first discovered your writing about animals, it was the Tiger Lady piece. And I had loved The Orchid Thief, and maybe I had read another profile before that, but that one was really struck me because my mom is an animal hoarder. So, you know, at one point in her life, she had like 30 birds. At another
Any
point,
tigers?
No tigers, but it was very much a there but for the grace of God kind of article for me to read. Like, well, we might have had several hundred birds, but we didn't have any tigers. So,
Good thing.
yeah.
Highly advisable.
So I found your writing about moving to the farm really fascinating because you seemed so comfortable with the desire to just follow your heart, move to the country, get some chickens and maybe a horse. You didn't seem to have any sort of concern about, ooh, am I like creeping into a territory that's a little bit excessive?
I didn't allow myself to give that any consideration. I just, even though I found myself acquiring at an impressive clip. I mean, one thing about living in the country and having a lot of space is that you have a whim. You know, you wake up in the morning and think, gee, I'd love a goat. And I mean, as one does. And there's nothing actually prohibiting you from getting a goat because you've got, I mean, I think this is why people in the country end up with a lot of animals that, you know, one day, and this is a true story, I'd gone to CVS to get shampoo, and on the drive home, I saw a sign on the road that said guinea fowl for sale, and, you know, I like pulled over. I thought, heck, I've never thought about having guinea fowl, but the opportunity has presented itself. And I showed up at home with 4 guinea fowl. And, you know, I already had chickens at that point, so it was simply an additive process. I never thought, and actually, quite seriously, writing the story about this tiger lady made me appreciate really the horrors of animal hoarding. And it's a pretty serious and extremely distressing phenomenon. So there was nothing hoardy. I mean, I was certainly acquisitive, but I never felt that I was entering the zone where I no longer could quite keep track of my animals.
Yeah.
I always knew what I had.
It really seems that way. It seems like you have such a healthy and untroubled sort of relationship to your own love of your hens and your turkeys and your guinea fowl and your cats and, you know.
I will say one thing, which is, until you mentioned this, I hadn't thought of it. I think part of the journalist's psychopathy is a bit of an arm's length relationship to the world. And I think that's partly why I'm fascinated by people who devote themselves passionately to something, because I think a journalist, by definition, is always the observer and one step outside that circle. So I've been fascinated by people who abandon themselves totally to something they're passionate about. But I'm, on a personal level, a bit, I won't say squeamish because that's not quite the right word, but I have definitely a hard stop on my ability to surrender to something. So I don't see myself as having any potential to be a hoarder. I mean, I'm even, you know, I love collecting things. And the minute I think, I'm becoming, you know, there was a brief time where I wanted to collect corncob pottery. Again, as one does. And I got a bunch of it, and then I had a minute of thinking, am I a corncob pottery person? And I thought, all right, no, I don't want, and then I actually didn't want any of it because because there are corncob pottery people. And there is just something in me that always stops and says, no, I'm not surrendering to this. Or more exactly, I'm not going to define my identity by this thing. And even saying I was a chicken person, I always thought, yeah, but Like, I don't get diapers for my chickens and let them live in the house. I mean, I'm not that kind of chicken person. I'm,
Right.
you know, and it's a point where I can stop and say, I don't fully identify, or my identity is not this thing.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who would, at least in theory, love to live on a farm and have chickens, but also has this real sort of like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't go there. It's just fascinating to me that you have that relationship to it. And one thing that struck me again and again as I was reading the book is the parts about your own farm and animals and relationship to them, at least, is that you write about your sort of your detachment from animals and your sort of what you're saying, this sort of, you love them and yet there's this sort of journalistic remove from them at times, but at the same time, you write about this relationship that you had with your turkeys, who would, tap on the window, when they wanted you to give them your attention when you were working, or, just how bereft you were when you had to put your chicken down, who was.
Yeah.
I found that really interesting because on the one hand, there is this like real sort of, you do have this fantastic ability to write about things journalistically, but there's a lot of heart in there, in those relationships.
It would be hard for me to write about something that I didn't have an emotional connection to. And, it was interesting to write about the farm and write about my animals, because I even have this hesitation of thinking, well, I shouldn't be writing about my animals. I should be writing about something outside of my own life. But the experience of living on a farm with animals was fascinating. And I definitely felt that I wasn't a real farmer. When my chicken got sick and I asked someone who had done some work at our house doing some carpentry, and I said, I'm really worried one of my chickens isn't doing well and she can't stand up. What should I do? And he looked at me like, what do you think you should do? And he made a gesture that I interpreted correctly as, break her neck. She's sick, put her out of her misery. And this was the dividing line where I thought, no, this is my chicken. This is like my pet. And yet livestock are not pets in the same way a dog or a cat is. But I thought, I guess I'm not a real farmer. And that's not to suggest that farmers are cruel. I think they just have a sort of economical view of what you do if you've got a bunch of chickens and one of them is sick. You don't spend a lot of time calling the Tufts Medical Center to speak to avian experts. And, I did. And, getting antibiotics, all for naught as it happened. She didn't improve, and that was that. But you do, I was straddling the line between being the suburban girl living this Green Acres fantasy and also having a fairly realistic attitude. I didn't think, I have a giant problem with the phrase fur babies. Like, I always think at the point at which you don't realize that your dog is not a baby, it's not a baby, it's a dog. And it doesn't mean you don't love it, but, I think this is a lot of what the book explores often, is that it's complicated to have feelings for animals. it's not a simple thing. It's very nuanced and complex.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that the book really gets into, particularly in your profiles and your articles about animals and about the people who interact with animals, especially wild animals, one thing that really comes through is sort of the difficulties that arise for animals when humans get involved a lot of the time. So, people who take animals for display, or people who, one of the saddest stories to me, I think, was the story of the young girl who she kept homing pigeons, the 13-year-old girl, and loved them and raced them, and then her family was moving. And then the pigeons would never be able to fly again.
Right. I mean, there was a incredible, for me, this realization that homing pigeons are pretty specific in their idea of what home is. And if you are living somewhere and you have homing pigeons and they're trained to think of that as their home, and you move, and you let them loose, they'll go back to your old house. They don't easily switch their allegiance. I mean, you can train them to bond with a new home, but it's hard to do. And most of the time people don't do it. And instead they never let the pigeons fly free again because they'll have to go retrieve them from their old house. And one of the people I interviewed in the course of doing the story was this older guy who'd been racing pigeons for decades, and he had a lot of them, and he really wanted to move. He lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and he complained bitterly about the weather and how sick of it he was, and how he wanted to move to Florida.
And he had cancer.
He had cancer. He was like terminally ill. And he said, but I can't move because what would happen to my pigeons? If I took them with me, they would be trapped. And the term, which is really poignant, the term you use for those birds is prisoners. They're known as, if someone says, oh, beautiful bird, do you race it? And you would say, no, it's a prisoner, meaning it moved from another coop and it can't be allowed to fly free anymore. And I thought, wow, talk about punch in the gut with the term prisoner. But they are prisoners. They're prisoners of their own instinct, which is the poignancy. So in the case of this girl, her family was moving out of South Boston to the suburbs, and she had to make a decision and she didn't have a big enclosed space for the birds. So if she kept them as prisoners, they didn't have a nice place to fly around, even if it was a closed space. So she was looking for someone who had an aviary who could keep them as prisoners, but in as good a situation as they could be in. And it was, to me, the chance to write about the idea of home and the poignancy that it, for me, brought out in such a vivid way. It was kind of a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, and it was, to me, I know it wasn't intended to be metaphorical exactly, because it's a story about real birds and real humans, but it just underscores the trickiness of that relationship when an animal, a non-human animal, calls the place where they live home, and then we move them away from it.
Yeah, but and I did mean it to be metaphorical. And it was interesting because I was living in Boston at the time, and it did not feel like home. And I think without me realizing it, I was sort of fascinated by what constitutes home, what feels like home. And in the case of this young girl, her family was moving to this new home, but the thing that she identified as being part of her home, which were her pigeons, couldn't come.
Yeah. I mean, so many of the pieces in this book are poignant in that way, but for whatever reason, probably because at one time I was living with 200 caged birds, that one just really stuck out.
That makes, I can see that.
Yeah, and just, I guess, even when I was young, I was just aware, there was the noise of all these parrots and all of that, but there was also just this awareness that like these beings were not meant to be confined like that. You know? So yeah, that really struck me. When you think about other pieces in the book, do any of them have that same kind of metaphorical resonance or echo with like the time in your life that you can think of?
Oh, that's a great question. They all, I certainly wrote these stories mostly out of some emotional connection to the subject, and some came about completely unrelated to the moment in my life when I was doing them, and some came out of, for instance, the profile of the show dog.
Truesdale.
Biff Truesdale, otherwise the quarterback on your high school football team. I kind of cut my teeth as a journalist, as many of us did, writing celebrity profiles. And I think it sort of dawned on me that I wanted to apply. Maybe this was like paying my penance for having done all of these celebrity profiles in my life, where I thought I'm going to take the template of the celebrity profile, but apply it to a dog and see if I could. And the fact is that it weirdly was exactly like profiling a celebrity, in the sense that I didn't ever really get an honest word out of the dog. So I was sort of reliving my early days as a journalist very much in the course of doing this story. But and because I'm fortunate enough to choose what I write about, they all come out of sometimes I'm not even conscious of what it is that sort of propels me, but these are not assignments. They really all have been stories that, for one reason or another, I stumbled across them and they just stuck in my head as something I wanted to explore.
When you think about the difference between writing something like the profile of Biff and writing something like your exploration of Keiko, the killer whale orca, I should say, who everyone wanted freed, do you approach them similarly, or is there a different kind of?
I think to begin with, it's very different to write about a domestic animal, like a dog or a cat, versus a wild animal. You instantly are treading into really complex issues about captivity when you're writing about a wild animal. Biff I really structured as a profile. I thought, I'm going to approach this just the way I profiled John Bon Jovi. No offense to John Bon Jovi. But I thought I want to sort of explore the form of the profile as much as I also had an abiding curiosity. If a dog is a top show dog, what is their life like? I mean, do they roll in mud puddles? Do they chew the wrong things? Do they still live as dogs, or are they knowing that, I mean, for instance, this dog had to watch his weight because he was a competitor, so he ran on a treadmill to stay slim, and he couldn't. I mean, when I think of how many treats I give my dogs, it's like constant, and I don't look at them and think, oh, this is not gonna look good. Sometimes I think, I'm getting a little porky, but this was something where his looks were his fortune, and he really lived a life that was more like that of Gigi Hadid than my dog Buck. I mean, where he had concerns that were exactly about how he looked, how his hair looked, if his nails looked good, who he was having sex with. I mean, these were all, well, maybe that's a little different, but it was so interesting to take the form of a profile that I had applied many, many times to humans, and just transfer it to a dog who was living a life that was very similar to the celebrities that I'd profiled. The story about Keiko was a very journalistic story, sort of tracking the narrative arc of this animal's life, which was really one of the strangest sagas that I've ever heard.
Did you want to read? I know we talked about the possibility of you reading a little bit, just for anyone who's unfamiliar.
Sure, I'll read from the lead of, the piece was called Where's Willie? And the reference is to the fact that Keiko had played Willie in the Free Willy movies. It was a hell of a time to be in Iceland, although by most accounts, it is always a hell of a time to be in Iceland, where the wind never huffs or puffs, but simply blows your house down. This was early in August, and it was stormy as usual, but the summer sun did shine a little, and the geysers belched blue steam and scalding water, and the glaciers groaned as they shoved tons of silt a few centimeters closer to the sea. On the water, the puffins frolicked, the hermit crabs frolicked, and the young people bloated with salmon jerky and warm beer barfed politely into motion sickness buckets on the ferry sailing across Kletzvik Bay. The young people were on their way to an annual songfest and drinkathon on the Westman Islands, a string of volcanic outbreaks off Iceland's southern coast. During the trip, they spoke in Icelandic about Icelandic things, like whether they had remembered bottle openers and bandanas, and then they turned greenish and stopped talking as the boat lurched up and down the huge cold waves. After 2 hours or so, the waves settled and the boat slowed and glided into Heme Harbor, which is ringed by cliffs of old lava that are as holy as Swiss cheese. Dozens of trawlers and knockabouts bobbed at their moorings, nudging the docks and making that clanging sound that is guaranteed to make you feel lonely. We sailed past a row of white buoys strung across the mouth of a small bay, marking off a section of water. A few of the young people, gummy-mouthed and bleary-eyed, roused themselves and gazed out the portholes. "Hey, Keiko," one girl exclaimed, pointing at the buoys. "Huh?" another mumbled, looking where the first one was pointing. "Keiko?" "Willie, Free Willy." "Oh, Keiko," the others said, pushing up to the window, yanking one another's sleeves, and gawking at nothing but the empty inlet, the glassy water, the blank looming cliffs. "Keiko, oh yeah, oh wow."
Yeah, the way that you evoke and describe the life of this orca in that piece it's another one that really stayed with me, and I had to research, of course, what happened to Keiko after the piece, and poor Keiko. But could you talk a little bit about that? What that was like researching?
Yes,
Yeah.
it was. Now I should say, when I first wrote the piece, I had it broken into sections, and each section began with a quote from Moby Dick. And I was determined that this was going to be my tribute to Moby Dick. And I turned it in, and David Remnick handed it back to me, and there was a red line through each of the Moby Dick quotes. And I thought, darn it, I was hoping that this was going to be the time Herman Melville and I appeared on the page together.
That's amazing. A little mini craft talk.
Yeah, well, and actually...
You're really getting your money's worth tonight.
Well, what was interesting is that it helped me write the piece. And I know that might sound weird and pretentious, but it was actually... It helped me. And so when those were removed, Remnick basically said, you don't need these. The story is there without them, but they informed the way I was writing the piece. And the epicness, because when you're writing about an animal that is just so huge, there's a kind of profundity to it that it seems silly, but it is actually an issue that you kind of grapple with. And it's part of why the captivity of whales is problematic, because they're so big and you can't properly give them a habitat. In the case of Keiko, his saga was almost as bizarre as the saga of Moby Dick. I mean, he kept moving. He was born in Iceland, captured when he was a baby, sold to an aquarium in Mexico, then starred in Free Willy, and went back to his aquarium in Mexico, presumably to sort of wallow there for eternity. And, Free Willy was a huge success. What the producers assumed is that people would respond to the movie by saying, oh my God, whales are amazing, and they would contribute to whale conservation. And instead, to their great surprise, people came to them and said, wait, what happened to the whale in the movie? And they were completely caught off guard because, and I'm not suggesting that they were heartless, but they didn't equate the possibility that people would say, no, I mean, whales are great, but what about that whale, the whale who was in the movie? And the answer was he was stuck in his aquarium in Mexico.
And the conditions you describe, were truly, I grew up in Florida, so, I was really aware of aquariums and that whole, I went to a lot of them when I was a kid, SeaWorld, and, I grew up in Miami, so there's one in Miami, or there used to be. This seems like it was really just sort of like the New York aquarium would be good by comparison.
Right, and this was a small, it was hot, there were no other orcas, so nothing about it was really proper. So there was this huge uproar, and people were demanding that Keiko be moved into better conditions. Also that he should be set free, but that kind of came a little further down the line. So they raised a ton of money and moved Keiko from Mexico to Newport, Oregon, where they had a more adequate aquarium. And by the way, this is why I love being a journalist. Guess how much Vaseline you need to buy when you are flying an orca from Mexico to Oregon? The answer is a lot of Vaseline, because you cover, someone out there was going to guess a lot, right? You have to keep him moist.
Right.
I'm sorry, it's very funny, even though the story had a lot of somber aspects. There were certain things that were incredibly funny. And just the idea of I think he flew with like 8 keepers who were massaging him with Vaseline. And of course, at wild expense, massive amounts of money. He was moved to Oregon, and the outcry didn't stop there. I mean, he had a very nice setup in Oregon, but people weren't content. And they said, well, wait, good that he's in a better aquarium, but the whale in the movie went free. Why shouldn't he go free? Now, in the movie, which I dutifully watched before I did the story, at the end of the movie, the kid says to the whale, "Go free, Willie." And, Willie leaps out of his tank. I mean, it's obviously questionably accurate. He leaps out of his tank and goes into the ocean, and he's free. I mean, which is great, but not so easily done when you have a whale who had been in captivity since he was a year old, who really liked people. I mean, he loved people. He loved frozen fish more than he liked catching fish. And I mean, it is our fault that this is who he became, but it is who he became. And it's funny, someone I know, to combine 2 stories, I wrote a story about the people who issue the No Animals Were Harmed rubric on movies. And I became friends with one of the people who's in the film and TV unit, and she worked on Free Willy. And she said, oh my God, he was like a dog. He would come and hang out while they were setting up shots and the lights and the camera. He would like come over and put his head on the side of the tank. I mean, he was completely accustomed to people and liked people. So, and he was scared of wild whales. They learned this when they first took him out into the ocean. He was afraid of them, and they probably thought he was a weirdo. He probably wasn't sending whale-like signals.
You said he couldn't create a bubble or whatever to
Right.
catch herring and all these normal orca activities.
I mean, he was a people pleaser.
Yeah.
And I think one of the sweetest, most improbable stories I heard was one of the trainers had taught him a behavior, and orcas are very intelligent and can be trained, which is why they became so popular as captive animals. And so she gave him a signal to go down deep in the water and bring up an object. And most of the time you would imagine, I mean, orcas are big, they would bring a boulder or a log or something big. He brought up a tiny feather. And, they were all kind of shocked. And then he dropped it, and he dove back down. And first they thought maybe he'll bring up something more appropriately sized, and he comes back up with the same feather, which is incredibly sweet. But it's probably not the behavior that's going to do you well if you're living in the Arctic Circle hunting. He was a little tender. And the story is not, the story has a bit of the Carpenter's Gothic quality, because it's a million people running around trying to get this whale free, and the whale is like, I'd rather stay here if you don't mind, and eat frozen fish. And money being thrown by the boatload at him, and all the while ignoring a very simple fact, which is that it's not easy to take a captive animal and release them into the wild, particularly if they've been captive since they were very young. So, and it had certainly never been attempted with a whale. You know, we've seen it. I mean, didn't the lions at the end of Born Free keep coming back, you know, to visit? I mean, it's not, we've had success in releasing birds and some animals into the wild, but it's a tricky thing. And certainly once animals get accustomed to us, particularly a really intelligent animal, maybe it's not possible to set them free.
Yeah, I mean, the way that you write about that tension throughout the book is just so interesting. Our desire to know animals, and then what our desire, even in less extreme circumstances, to know them and to be near them, you know, what that creates for them.
Right. It's not a simple thing. And in the stories, for instance, the story I wrote about this man in South Africa who is on intimate terms with these lions, you know, that is rarely a scenario that came about naturally, you know, and these were lions that had been raised to be petted in a petting zoo. So they, you know, but again, it would be hard to set those lions loose in the wild. They're used to people in a way that is going to kind of deform their instincts.
Yeah, so fascinating. And you know, one thing you were talking about, the piece that you wrote about the no animals were harmed folks, and I was really fascinated. I had never thought about, I mean, I should have thought about cockroaches on a film set because I've
You
seen
should
movies
have thought
where,
about cockroaches.
where there were many cockroaches on a film set. But you were saying you might read a little bit.
Yeah, I'll read a little
Yeah.
from this because you'll think I'm making it up, but I want you all to know this is all factual. According to the American Humane Guidelines, no animal actor should have to work like a dog. For instance, if an ape is on a movie set for more than 3 consecutive days, the production must provide a play area or a private park where the ape can exercise and relax. When a bear is working on a film, anything that produces smells that might bother the bear, such as cheap perfume, strong liquor, or jelly donuts, must be removed from the location. Only cats that get along with dogs can be cast in cat and dog movies. No individual fish can be required to do more than 3 takes in a day. Also, under no circumstances can an animal cast member be squished. This rule applies to all non-human actors, including cockroaches. Karen Rosa, the director of American Humane's Film and Television Unit, was discussing this particular guideline one day last summer. If you show up on set with 25,000 cockroaches, you better leave with 25,000 cockroaches, she said. I wondered if she extended the same welcome to cockroaches at home. She shook her head. A cockroach in my kitchen is one thing, she said. A cockroach in a movie is an actor. Like any other actor, it deserves to go home at the end of the day.
What was that like, researching that story?
It was such a wonderful experience. I mean, for one thing, there was a lot of really interesting history about animals in Hollywood, and you can kind of track a lot of the moral code in film. It follows the same arc as the way animals were treated in Hollywood. And for a long time, they were treated as absolutely expendable. They were just props, and they were treated horribly. Then there was a great uproar, and codes were written involving their safety and care. But those rules were bundled with the rules, censorship rules, like you couldn't show people kissing on screen, and you couldn't show a man and a woman in a bed together on screen. So when those moral codes were overturned, when there was a huge outcry and the Hayes office was dismantled, the rules that protected animals went with it. So it's an odd kind of compounding of these two things. And
what you describe, I mean, I'm sure I had known these, but the details that you give of what went wrong in both of those stages, what animals were subjected to, just really
it's
horrifying.
Terrible. And, in the early days of cinema, Westerns were incredibly popular. So that meant hundreds of horses, and horses were really treated like disposable goods. It's shocking.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, even now, realizing, like, to make, every scene you see in a Western, at some point someone shoots and the horse falls over and the cowboy falls over. Well, they just use wires to trip the horses. And of course, that's going to harm them.
And you said sometimes there was a hole drilled through the hoof.
In order to make these tripwires really effective, they would drill a hole in the hoof, attach the wire, and at the point where they want the horse to fall, they'd pull the wire. And of course the horse would fall, usually breaking its legs, which meant euthanizing the horse. And interestingly, one of the people who really raised the alarm about this was Roy Rogers. And he was very active in saying, my horse Trigger, who is the best trained horse in film, I never treat him harshly, and there's no excuse for doing what's being done. There were so many animals in early cinema. They were present in this is how I ended up writing my book, Rin Tin Tin.
I was going to say, we won't be able to talk about it now, sadly, but you should definitely read that book. It's really...
Well, it was in the course of doing this research for that story where I'm reading about all the history of animals in Hollywood, and of course the name Rin Tin Tin comes up if you look at animals in Hollywood, and I went down that wormhole and came out 8 years later. As my editor, the loud chuckle in the audience coming from my editor. But it was also a case, I had so much fun doing that story, and also going on this film set and observing. This was a high, actually was considered a medium action film called Soccer Dog, and where, the most difficult trick that the dog had to perform was to look in a mean way at a bad guy. But still, anytime you see no animals were harmed, that's the indication that a representative from American Humane was on set. And in the movies that involve lots and lots of animals, they are in the production meetings from the beginning, making sure that provisions are made to keep the animals from being hurt. Or sometimes the provisions are a little extreme, like I think a bear would like jelly donuts on a set, but that's because I grew up watching Yogi Bear, and he liked jelly donuts very much. But it's about morality. What do we owe these beings? And we use them in movies. Can we treat them in an offhanded way and make them uncomfortable? You might think, really, do you need to count all your cockroaches? But they make a bottom line, which is no animals should be harmed, and that means no animals were harmed. And if if a film says that, you can be really sure that even if it looked like, there was a lot of uproar at the end of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, where it looks like they drive into a cow. And, one of the problems is saying no animals were harmed in the making of the movie doesn't mean they don't look like they're harmed in the movie. And people freaked out because this really looks like a cow gets hit by a car. So there was a lot of disclaimer posted explaining how they shot the film and that the cow was never anywhere near the car, and that it was CGI for the part where it's actually being hit. But the film and television unit are there to protect the actors who are not human. And one other thing, and I know that we're probably running low on time, and I love this fact because it tells you so much about humanity, which is the provisions for taking care of animals also included children, human children.
Really?
Yeah.
You may have said that in the piece, but I forgot about that.
But American Humane was founded to protect animals and children.
Wow.
I mean, that is what it was. It was the Humane Society to protect animals and children, which I just love.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I had some other questions of my own I wanted to ask you, but I'm going to defer to the audience here. So the first question is, you write some of the best leads around. Tell us how you do it. Do they tend to come first?
Oh, well, thank you. And they do come first. I'm afflicted, unfortunately, with the need to write from the beginning to the end. So I just, even if I know big chunks of a story that I'm going to include that I could write more easily, to me the lead sets the tone, and I can't get to those other pieces without going from the beginning through. And so there's a lot of time spent sitting around. For me, the best thing that ever happened was the moment when I realized a lead didn't have to be a little synopsis of the story. And that's a huge revelation, because I think initially when you write a nonfiction piece, you feel compelled to say, this is what the story is going to be about, and then now I'm going to tell you what the story is about. And it's not a very beckoning way to begin, because then you can just read the first sentence and you don't have to read the rest of the story. I began picturing the lead as the opening gambit at a dinner party where people are chattering and you want to get everyone's attention for a second and have them stop chattering and listen to you, and then keep listening as you continue on. So it seemed to me more important to have that lead be absolutely charming or funny or sexy or slightly bewildering, where you would think, well, I want to hear the rest of it, or rhythmically, like the Keiko lead to me was, I wanted it to be this rhythmic thing that you felt you couldn't stop reading, that it was part children's nursery rhyme about huffing and puffing, and that you would just have no choice. I don't like readers to feel they have the option to stop reading. And each lead, in the case of my lead for the profile of the show dog, I thought, look, everybody, no matter how mature they think they are, thinks it's really funny that female dogs are called bitches. So I'm gonna just go for it, make that joke, put it to rest. I'll never do it again. And, I couldn't help it. I thought it was hilarious. And I also thought, this is my one and only shot at making this joke. But also, the lead is, if I were a bitch, I'd be in love with Biff Truesdale. And in fact, I was totally enchanted by this dog. He was really charismatic and beautiful. And so I sort of entered the story with that emotion, which is I was smitten with this dog. And actually, the more I thought about his good qualities, I thought, I feel like I'm on a dating site. Like, he's handsome, he's rich, he wants children, you know. It came very readily as soon as I allowed myself to make that super immature joke.
That's, that's so great to know. Is the collection of animals, someone wants to know, a stand-in for meaningful human connection?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think animals aren't a stand-in for human connection. I think they're a different kind of connection that we need just as much. But certainly putting this book together during COVID, when there was an unprecedented kind of rush to puppy adoption and animal embrace, it felt not so much a substitute as much as it was a comforting place to put emotion and attention. And also, I mean, this is something that occurred to me later. This was a time also where I think some of us felt really discouraged by other humans and disappointed in other humans. And one thing about animals is they never disappoint you. They don't make you angry. I mean, this was a period of time of a lot of frustration and anger, I think, for a lot of people, feeling like, why can't people behave in the interest of common good? And animals felt like a very comforting place to turn when you're sort of fed up with humanity.
Speaking as someone who went from a reasonable 2 cats and 1 dog at the beginning of the pandemic to a not so reasonable 2 dogs and 3 cats now, I hear you, sister. Yeah.
I also think that the sort of elementalness of taking care of animals is very soothing. I mean,
you talk about that with the chicken coop,
yeah.
Like how you found that really fulfilling, like they need some water, they need it cleaned out.
Yeah,
you know?
And it's so simple, and at a time when life felt so confusing and complicated, responding to animals and the directness of what they need and what you can do for them is very satisfying.
So
I got a puppy during the pandemic. I also baked bread and made yogurt and did a jigsaw puzzle. So I've kind of been playing pandemic bingo, and I think I won.
So this person also asks, where do you consider your home? Which ties into a question I had about, you had to sell your farm, and how are you feeling about being in LA? And, you know.
Well, I love LA, and I feel, I mean, we ended up there kind of by accident, which sounds weird, like you end up somewhere by accident, but we had gone there imagining that it was a year and a sort of break from the winter, and I expected that we would return to the farm. And, you know, one day I thought, you know, I heard myself telling people constantly in LA, oh yeah, we just moved here. And then one day I thought, yeah, 10 years maybe doesn't mean just anymore. That, you know, 10 years had passed. And I love LA. I think it is maddening, fascinating. It's this crazy, weird mix, which I love. It appeals to me as a writer very much. And, you know, I got out there and I A, didn't plan to stay, and B, had vowed never to write a book. And so, of course, I stayed for 10 years and wrote a book about LA. So, I found myself drawn in. It's an incredibly irresistible subject, for sure. And the other day a mountain lion walked through our backyard. So I'm not absent from the animal world, it's just a little different. And
you also mentioned, I think, like coyotes and hawks and owls
and bobcats and yeah, you very much feel that you are living in the animals world in LA. You feel like the city of LA is superimposed on this wilderness because there's a lot of wilderness. And I do love living there, I do. And I feel like now that we acknowledge that we haven't just moved there and that a decade has gone by, do I feel like it's home? I don't know, but I'm really enjoying being there. And certainly in this last 2 years, it's really been a great place to be.
Well, someone asked what became of the farm and its animals. So.
Well, the animals, first of all, there was a horrible massacre, and a raccoon killed all of my chickens and guinea fowl. And I was devastated, and I had sent the turkeys back to live with the friend I'd gotten them from. And I just thought, I can't get chickens again. I ended up getting 4 chickens, but the young lady who cleans our house wanted them. So when we were leaving at the end of the summer, she took them and she was thrilled because I had a little rooster, a very lively, sexy little rooster, and she was thrilled. The cattle we would get every spring and sell them in the fall, so we were always just cycling them sort of half a year. So, the animals ended up, by the time we sold our house, the animals had all, either through this horrible, seriously, raccoons are monsters, and they didn't even eat them. They just came in and killed them all. And
we have a lot of raccoons in Queens. So
yeah, they're amazing animals, but they're also freaks, and they came in and killed just a bunch of chickens and guinea fowl. Anyway, I won't perseverate on this fact, but so the animals all ended up finding good sort of places to be, and we took the dog and the cats, and the house, we sold it to people who I think really love it, and we drove by the other day in, that creepy peeping Tom thing you do where you drive by your old house. It's like, and of course I miss it. I had a house in the Hudson Valley since 1990, so it's a long, long time that I've been connected there. So I definitely miss it.
Which animal did you connect with the most deeply when you were reporting the essays for the book?
Well, I certainly connected with Biff, and I think that's partly because he's a dog, and so I was able to, hug him, and I spent some time alone with him, which I detail in the story, to some humiliating outcome. But I insisted on having time alone with him for my interview. And dogs are just easy, but I had a weirdly profound experience with Keiko. And I couldn't imagine that you would have I didn't ever look at a whale and think, well, I can have a profound experience with a whale. But after he came back to Iceland, he had left and gone to Norway and then ended up coming back to Iceland. he just was hanging around the dock, and they were trying to wean him off his relationship with people. But they said, if you want to go hang out with him, you can. And I said, well, can I touch him? And they said, don't tell anybody, but you can touch him. So I went down to the dock. And I think part of the thing with whales is they're so big that it takes you a while to find their eye. And of course, that's where you connect with an animal. So I was like looking at him thinking that was his head. And then I thought, wait, no, that's not his head. Oh, there's his head. And, you can't, they're just so big. And he hung out next to me at the dock. And I felt really moved. And I touched him, which was a giant thrill. And he felt kind of what I expected, like a wet inner tube. So for those of you interested in touching a whale, just find an inner tube. And I really felt, first of all, his story was, I got very involved in it. And it was a story that had incredible emotion and tragedy. But he was there was something about him that was so appealing. And I felt surprised by how moved I was being near him. So, of course, I immediately wanted to get a whale. Because that's my outcome of all these stories. I want a tiger. I want a lion. But I just thought, oh my God, I love him. And it kind of broke my heart when he died soon after that.
Yeah. And I love that, toward the end of the piece, you write about how he showed up in Norway and was just getting French fries or whatever it was from kids,
Yeah, in Norway, it was such a dumb choice for him because Norway is the only country, or one of the few countries, that permits whale hunting. And so, a member of parliament said, we should just harpoon him, he's a pest. And he was hanging out near a public park and letting children sort of play with him. He really was very gentle. And also, I think he was lonely. I think he wanted to be around people.
Yeah. Well, this is a great question to end on because I often thought of E.B. White while I was reading the book. So someone asks, are there writers, someone like E.B. White comes to mind as a gentleman farmer who chronicled his animal care adventures, who have influenced your animal writing particularly?
Well, E.B. White, whatever he wrote about, influenced me and filled me with awe. I'm not sure that there's somebody, Verlin Klinkenberg used to do a column about living on his farm that I read and was always very jealous and felt like I should have his job. But I think my writing, I don't know that I looked at other people who wrote about farm life particularly. The people who I look to constantly for inspiration, like John McPhee and Joan Didion, Tom Wolfe. One characteristic is they wrote about a lot of different things. To me, it was their eye and voice that inspired me and felt like if you have those things, you can write about anything. Whether it's something you enjoy personally, like animals, or something that you have no connection to, but you want to explore it.
Well, I think your voice is as distinctive as any of theirs, and I want to show you all this book again. It's very beautiful, and obviously you should all get your own copy. And then when you read it on social media, you can put a little hen next to it as you're extolling the You know,
Oh,
it's
right.
brilliant.
There is, yeah.
Yeah, I've been enjoying using the hen icon for this.
I like that there's a hen emoji. I think it's an
Yeah, right,
important
emoji, that's the
development in the modern world for sure.
Exactly.
And I, just in conclusion, I would say that this really has been a labor of love. These are pieces that I loved doing because I love being around animals, and there's a challenge that is the obvious deep challenge to write about a subject that you'll never have the power of language to explore. So as a writer, it presents this enduring, unrequitable desire, which is, can I understand or interpret what is going on inside these creatures?
I'm really looking forward to your, I hope, eventual writing about all the animals in LA.
Yeah, well, I hope this mountain lion, I mean, as excited as I was, because how cool is that? And, my neighbor caught this mountain lion on her security camera, and I just was like thrilled. I thought, oh my God, this is so exciting. And then the next day, another neighbor caught a picture of the mountain lion, and he had a cat dangling from his mouth. And I thought, well, yeah, it's super cool that there's a mountain lion in the neighborhood. But it was also, again, this moment of realizing that, I had said to someone something about animals living in LA, and then I thought, well, it's actually people living in the animal kingdom, and that he's probably thinking, what are we doing there? And I ought to get these humans on my security camera, as opposed to the other way around. And you definitely feel it in LA because it's bled into the wilderness so much, more than what you feel in New York, for sure.
Well, it's been such an honor to talk with you about this book.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.